I'm Rita Parhad. Thank you, Janae. I'm president at Protagonist, and our work is really focused on using large media data sets to identify and track narratives across all sorts of issue areas. And before we dive into this research, I want to tell you a little bit of the origin story of where this research came from. We've been working with Lumina Foundation since 2016, tracking the narratives about higher education and about economic opportunity and social mobility in large media data sets, primarily traditional media, but we've also looked at social media. And what we found is the first several years we were tracking that conversation, it was a pretty low conflict, almost boring, sort of stable conversation, sort of technocratic, and really had reflected a set of shared assumptions about the value of higher education. In recent years, we've seen a total transformation of that conversation, that public conversation. It has become more polarized, more politicized, and really there's no more consensus about the value of higher ed in the US. And so this led us to ask, how did this happen, and sort of who did this? And what we have noticed, we track a lot of different social sector issues, and we have seen a similar kind of shift in most of the conversations, most of the public conversations we track in recent years, but nowhere was it more dramatic than what we've seen in higher ed. So together with our Lumina colleagues, we said, well, what if we tried to understand where this trend came from, or this shift came from? And what we found is that the majority of these highly politicized narratives originated and were amplified by a set of right-wing outlets. And so we said, what if we did a study that really just honed in on those outlets and said, what have they been doing the last several years? What have they been pushing out, and how has that been shaping our conversation, not just about higher ed, but about sort of all the issues that we care about? And that's sort of the beginning of this research. So I'll hand to Sydney to begin to talk you through what we found.
Thank you. So as Rita said, we began by interrogating the right-wing media ecosystem. And when I say right-wing media ecosystem, precisely what I mean are the 38 outlets arrayed at the bottom of the screen here. From those 38 outlets, we pulled every piece of content published between January 2020 and September 2023, and that amounted to 2.2 million rows of data, 2.2 million articles from which we then used human and machine-led techniques to identify the core frames that are being espoused in that content. From there, we create custom machine learning classifiers such that each of those 2.2 million articles is assigned a specific label for the strategic narrative that it's espousing. So to start, let's get a first look at this data. I'm going to press play here on this racing bar chart that shows the relative focus on a given set of topics in this ecosystem over time. We can see that we're moving day by day through this time period. And the first thing that you might notice is the level of dynamism in this chart. We just saw COVID, for example, skyrocket at the beginning of 2020, and it will precipitously decline thereafter. And I like to start with this graph in part because I think it's a lot of fun, and we could probably all sit here for the full 3 minutes and watch it. But also because I think it's quite useful to ground us in the data that underlies what we'll present today. That all of these topics are present in that 2.2 million row data set. And this is, in fact, a news cycle, so we can see these topics rise and fall with regularity. But this research is not so much about the topics that are being discussed as the stories that are being told about these various topics. And for that, we actually see a high level of consistency. So we identified 4 strategic narratives that are advanced by the right-wing media ecosystem. The first of which is reject the woke agenda. This narrative argues that there is a war over our American cultural identity, and the left, with its indoctrination and its social justice warriors, are winning that war. This is a narrative that I don't need to tell you more about because we can all fill in how it sounds in our head, and that's because it seems to be everywhere. So in the work that we do across various social issue landscapes, this is a narrative that has touched almost all of the social issues that we study. And that's because ultimately this strategic narrative derives its energy from attacking progressive social movements. Second is a narrative called Americans Under Siege. This strategic narrative, if Reject the Woke Agenda is about cultural threats, is a story about physical threats. Americans Under Siege argues that we have a crime and lawlessness problem in this country. And importantly, if this is a story of physical threats, this strategic narrative argues that a physical response is often warranted. It calls for things like vigilantism, for law and order, for a stronger police state, for the deployment of the National Guard in Los Angeles. Third is a narrative called Preserve Capitalism. This narrative argues that we know that free market capitalism works because we live in the most successful country in the history of the world. It's a narrative that argues that we live in a meritocracy and therefore is often used to attack racial equity initiatives and access to the social safety net. And ultimately, this narrative argues that you must accept the system that we have, lace up your bootstraps, and get to work. Finally, the fourth strategic narrative is called Expose the Deception. This strategic narrative argues that things just don't add up today, and you can't trust people in power to tell you why. This is a strategic narrative that works to build a culture of conspiracy and therefore argues that the right-wing media ecosystem are the only key messengers that you can trust. And so when we step back and we look at these four strategic narratives as a set, you'll notice that they interlock with one another to advance one single, unified, cohesive political project. And that's borne out in the way that they're deployed across the right-wing media ecosystem. So what you're looking at here is a list of each of those 38 right-wing media outlets with the bar chart filled to the proportion of content that each outlet uses one of these four strategic narratives. And what you'll notice immediately is that all but one of these 38 outlets use these strategic narratives in the majority of content that they publish. And on average, about 3/4 of all content from these outlets is dedicated to these four strategic narratives. And while we hypothesized that we would see a disciplined ecosystem, this is still a striking level of cohesion across all of these outlets. And when we look one level deeper at the narrative use across the ecosystem, we can see here these narratives as they change over time. The first thing you'll notice is that Reject the Woke Agenda is the most used strategic narrative by this ecosystem and increases over this time, reflecting an increasing focus on social and culture war issues. Second is Americans Under Siege. This narrative really benefits from a constant drumbeat of publication to stoke fear about crime and immigration. Third, Expose the Deception. This reflects how deeply conspiratorial ideas are embedded within this ecosystem. And finally, Preserve Capitalism, what we might call the most classically conservative of these four, is the bottom of this list, but we would caution against discounting it. And so when we look at the way that these narratives are used, despite all of that dynamism that I showed you in our very first bar chart, you can see that there's a stark amount of consistency in the way that these four stories are told. And that reflects a critical function of this ecosystem, that no matter what the new story of the day is, no matter how those topics rise and fall, almost everything can be filtered through one, if not more, of these four strategic narratives, such that any event that comes up is able to reinforce the strategic aims of these narratives, that cohesive political project.
So I want you to sit with these narratives for a moment, think about what they are, and I would wager that many of you who might not even be consumers of right-wing media find these somewhat familiar. And that goes to the ubiquity of these narratives, not just in right-wing spaces, but they've sort of pervaded the atmosphere. So I want you to keep that in mind as we shift gears and look at what we found in left-wing media outlets. I said at the beginning we were interested in not just, say, right-wing media outlets and what they're doing, but how a public conversation gets shaped and who are the actors who are doing it. We started with the right wing because we knew there was power there. We had a sense that that's where a lot of the energy was coming from, but we wanted to understand how does that look on the left to the extent that there are analogous outlets on the left. So Sydney will take you through that research really quickly.
So just with the right, we also began here on the left-wing media ecosystem with a core set of outlets, in this case 37 left-wing media outlets, from which we pulled all data between January 2020 and December 2024. Now, if that number in the middle is staring at you the way that it did at us, you'll see that there was fewer than 300,000 articles in a longer time period coming from the left-wing media ecosystem. And that reflects our first core distinction between the left and the right-wing media ecosystems, that there is far less content produced from the left. But of course, that's not where the distinctions end. So we found double the number of strategic narratives were advanced by the left-wing media ecosystem. And unlike the way that I just described those right-wing media narratives as interlocking, the strategic narratives on the left have key fracturing points. So for the sake of time, I will not walk us through each of these 8 strategic narratives individually, but I want to bring forth a couple examples that highlight a key schism within this ecosystem. That there are those strategic narratives that argue for a restoration and preservation of our institutions, and those that argue for a transformation of entire social systems. So these first 2 strategic narratives, existential threat to America and welcome to the clown zone, are our most partisan narratives on the left-wing media ecosystem. They are squarely focused on the Republican Party. Existential threat to America adopts a grave tone, arguing that the Republican Party is powerful, adept, and decidedly authoritarian, and we must restore our democratic processes while we still can. Welcome to the Clown Zone has a very different tone. It bemoans Republican antics for their frivolity, it wonders at their incompetence, and it yearns for the days where decency in politics was normal. This is a strategic narrative that, if anything, calls for peace and quiet. But where these 2 strategic narratives have deeply opposing tones, they're in lockstep in calling for the restoration of our current institutions. That'll contrast a strategic narrative like End the Oligarchy, which expands its aperture of critique to include both Republicans and Democrats alongside CEOs and billionaires and big tech and those that profit off of working class labor. This is a strategic narrative that is defined by critiquing the very institutions that Existential Threat to America and Welcome to the Clown Zone defend. And that makes it more in line with a strategic narrative like Institutions of Oppression, which argues that the foundations of genocide and slavery upon which this country were built endure today, and that in order for us to build something truly just, it must be something new. And so importantly, when we look at this set of strategic narratives, we see not only that they don't interlock, but that they actually advance different political projects. They have different strategic aims. And that too is borne out in the way that this ecosystem operates. So now we're looking at a graph that shows, again, each of those 37 left-wing media outlets, but this time filled with the narrative distribution that each of those outlets deploys. And when we looked at the narrative usage by outlet, we found that they cohered into 3 cohorts of outlets, each that advance a different way to understand the world. This first, defined primarily by its use of Existential Threat to America and Welcome to the Clown Zone, is primarily concerned with partisan dynamics. The second, defined primarily by its use of End the Oligarchy and its avoidance of narratives like Welcome to the Clown Zone, is primarily concerned with power dynamics. And a third cohort still primarily frames the world in terms of cultural dynamics. And so when we zoom out to consider the way that this ecosystem operates, we see not only that these narratives are not interlocking, but that they are not asserting a unified view of the world, such that wherever you sit in this different ecosystem, you're understanding competing interpretations. And this might be the most fundamental difference between what we saw in the right-wing media ecosystem.
So that was like a very high-level overview of the research. There's much more to it, so if you all have questions, we can take them in the afternoon session. But we wanted to pause here and say that the way we think of these outlets and these ecosystems is as narrative actors, and they are shaping our current reality. These 70 some odd are not the sum total of all the narrative actors in play. They are a particularly strong set on the right and a, let's say, slightly less strong set on the left. And they fill out the sort of ideological endpoints of our larger public discourse. But we're also very interested in other narrative actors, and we're currently doing work looking at what we think of as mainstream national outlets and what role they're playing in our larger information environment and shaping our public conversations. And in part, one of the questions we're asking there is, to what degree are mainstream outlets carrying water for or amplifying or reinforcing what we hear or see from the left and the right? And what else are they bringing to the conversation? What else are they doing? An additional set of outlets and actors that we're very interested in are sort of the other kinds of news outlets, independent, local, nonprofit news outlets and the roles that they play, particularly because they have a very strong role to play in building and rebuilding trust. So what role are they playing in an environment like this, and particularly in a multiracial democracy like ours? So we think of these all as media actors, narrative actors that are shaping a public conversation, but there are other narrative actors that also fill out how we think about where our conversation is. And that would include creators, influencers, other artists, other sorts of activists that are also shaping the conversation. This is not meant to suggest this is all there is. But a final note I'll leave with is that media actors, news media actors in particular, have a particularly important role when it comes to shaping our understanding of the public sphere and public goods. And so what we as citizens in this country should expect of our government and what we should demand of our government is really highly shaped by the news media. And that is one for us to be thinking about as we read the reports about what's happening in LA or what has happened over the last few months or the last several years. How do we think about the way that things are reported, the narratives that are reinforced about how they shape our expectations for what we can expect, what we should demand, and where we should go from here? So to the extent that some of this was depressing, although perhaps affirming of a reality that we're all experiencing, I apologize. But I think this is also, we think of it as a way of saying this is where we are. This is what the data shows about where we are, and in order to change that environment, we actually have to know where we are, know what's working, know what's connecting, know the strategic nature of what we're up against, and have a plan and a strategy that actually deals with the nature of that threat. I think the afternoon session will delve more into how we think about those strategies and the roles of narrative actors like yourself. So thank you very much, and we'll hope to see you this afternoon.